Hello. Hello. Let me just get situated here. Hello. I'm going to hard launch this because I have recorded this and re-recorded this about 40 million times, and every time I sit down or think about it too long, I decide I hate it and I throw it all out and I start again. And that's really, really unhelpful because this is something that I do actually want to do. So this is the hard launch. Hello and welcome. This is the Quarter Life Crisis Club. I'm Vicky, and I am in no way, shape or form qualified to talk about any of this except lived experience and the fact that your girl can research. That's all I have. That is literally all I can offer you. But if we start at the very beginning of what sparked this, what brought all this on, was that over the summer, particularly sort of August, 2025 was a fantastic year for me. I must say that I'm very grateful for all the opportunities and everything that happened. It was phenomenal. But I spent a lot of the summer having quite an intense internal identity crisis. And that's come from lots of things. I was closing down a business that I had spent my early 20s grafting to build up. We got a dog. I got married. Lots and lots of things that happened that, whilst incredible, led me to feel completely unqualified as an adult. Completely unqualified, and that I actually had no authority to be doing what I was doing, and that I shouldn't be doing it, basically. I had a massive internal panic of, oh my God, who has allowed me to get to this point, and who is going to come and pull the strings because I'm not grown up enough to be doing any of this? Who has allowed this, essentially? It felt like the manager had left. You know those days where the manager leaves the office and you're like, oh my God, there's no one here to babysit us? That's how I felt. I felt like I was not being babysat. The people had left the chat. So after a process of, I would say, a good few months of just feeling completely unqualified to be living the life that I had built, I took to the internet. I was born in 1999. All I know is the internet in terms of research. Gone are the days my mum would ask me to pull out an encyclopedia. I take to Google or TikTok, but that's an issue for another time. I take to the internet to look at what on earth is going on, because I was convinced that I was the only one that was feeling the way I was feeling, which in hindsight was really stupid because of course I wasn't. But that was the way it felt. It felt really, really isolating. So I was Googling all these identity crises, like, was I making, not mistakes, but how did I know that what I was doing was the right thing? Was I ever going to know that if what I was doing was the right thing? Is this kind of like a suck it and see moment? Am I making a mistake? Will this all go pear-shaped? Who knows, but let's go anyway, kind of thing. And that is when I stumbled upon the term quarter life crisis. And how old was I last year? 25. I was 25 last year. Bang on. My aim is to live to 100, if you know me. So yeah, quarter life crisis was what pinged up. And the more research I did on it, the more digging I did, the more reading, the more research, the more and more I found out, more interested I was, because I feel at this point in history to be having a quarter life crisis is really, really interesting, because we're at a point of history. I mean, every point of history is new because duh, but we're at a really crucial point in history where this has never been done before. The internet is so new and so expansive, and people, especially people of my age, my generation, we're becoming adults in a way that no one has become adults before. I think that's what I'm getting at. I think it's a hard time to be in your early adulthood right now, I think, is what I'm trying to say. And I think that is why it feels so much more intense, which is why so many more people are having these identity crises. But we will get to that in a minute. So the definition of a quarter life crisis is an existential period, typically mid-20s to mid-30s, average age of 27, of anxiety, self-doubt, and questioning life's direction, often triggered by career, relationship, financial pressures, leading to feelings of being stuck or inadequate despite societal expectation. And that's a big one. It goes on to say, it's a transformative phase involving deep soul searching, identity confusion, and a need for change where individuals reflect on their values versus current realities, seeking new and meaningful purpose. Now that sounds lovely, actually, doesn't it? That sounds really profound and really exciting. Like, you would love to do this. And essentially that is what I experienced, but it was a much more violent crash out of, oh my God, what am I doing with my life? And am I doing it right? I think that was the biggest thing, was that, am I doing it right? There was no profound soul searching. There was profound soul searching. There was a lot of identity confusion and I suppose a need for change. And I can pinpoint what it was triggered by. As I said before, I was closing down a business that I had grafted my early 20s, my university career in my early 20s into doing, while setting up something that I felt served a bigger purpose. I was getting married, and financial pressures, my God, let's talk about that. Constant at the minute because he lives, babe. So for me, it became very obvious what was triggering this. The trigger and the outcome weren't as linked as I'd have thought they'd have been, in terms of, there was so much, identity stuff, but there was so much more in terms of, I'm closing down this business that I love, that's made me really good money, and I really set myself up and established myself. So why did it feel so emotional and like I was cheating myself, like I was giving up? All of this, it felt really, really strange. But that is, and I'm sure, again, in conversations I've had with so many friends now, because that was the first step in this, I think, was opening up to my friends, my peers, and saying, look, this is how I'm feeling. Do you guys feel the same way? And they absolutely did. That was what really, really blew me away, was that everyone was having these feelings in silence and no one was talking about it, which we'll come on to in a minute when we talk about the external, internal causes of it. But the symptoms are feeling trapped, stuck in a job, relationship, or a life path you necessarily didn't choose. Comparison anxiety, constantly comparing your progress to your peers and feeling behind. Uncertainty and a lack of purpose. Anxiety and low mood and restlessness and urge to make a drastic change, or fear of making the wrong move. I will say that I did phone my friend at about 6 a.m. one day after I hadn't really slept, saying I was going to shave my head, and she can vouch for that. I didn't, thankfully, because I'm far too vain to cut my hair, but I definitely felt all of these symptoms, and in conversation with other people, they did too. And I think it's just because, we're being dubbed the anxious generation, aren't we? And I think it's so much more than that. I think there's the anxiety that we're all collectively experiencing feeds into something so much bigger than us being brushed off constantly. That's how I feel anyway. But yeah, so that in a nutshell is what a quarter life crisis is defined at. And this term has been coined rather recently. It was coined first by clinical psychologist Alex Fowke, Fowke, for anyone, because I'm dyslexic and can't pronounce stuff for toffee, around 2001. So just after the millennium. And it's been compared, obviously, to the term midlife crisis, which was coined in 65. Now, that is typically your midlife crisis is typically 45 to 65. Psychology was formally founded as a distinct scientific discipline in 1879, which means we've only had, I've got maths, 112 years since the term quarter life crisis was coined, that we first put words to what this feeling was. And the midlife crisis was coined first, and that was, 60. So sort of 85 years after the founding of psychology, we got the midlife crisis. And then a following 30, 45 years later, we had the quarter life crisis. So it's only really been 100, and if we go up to today's date, it's only really been sort of 140, 150 years that we've really been looking at the way our brains work and studying that. So around 1950, Erik Erikson coined the term identity crisis. So in terms of history, we have really only been evaluating the way our brains think for a very, very short period of time. The study is so modern, but experiencing it isn't. And I think that's the key takeaway of this. And now we're just doing it louder, and we're far more obsessed with understanding it. So why are more Gen Z having existential crises? Why are more Gen Z having existential crises? And apparently it is millennials and Gen Zs, because the boomers love to blame us for everything. And unfortunately, they may have been right when they said it was your phone causing the problem, if that's a conversation that you guys are ready to have. But apparently these crises, especially among Gen Z, which I do fit into, as I said, as a 99 baby, we saw a very interesting period. There was a study done that children born between 97 and 2003 are in a really unique period of history, because we are the first that grew up. We are the first that grew up with tech, but we grew up with tech, but the tech, we grew up alongside as the tech was evolving. So it was never in front of us. So I can remember TV, I can remember laptops, I can remember getting my first smartphone, but it always felt as though we were one step ahead of that. So I got my first phone when I had to get the bus to and from high school, which I know was a big thing, but smartphones weren't around. I was going to say my Motorola Razr that my dad gave me to play with, because I was desperate for a phone when I was about 8 or 9, didn't have a SIM card and it didn't work. But smartphones weren't a thing. We didn't have access to that kind of technology. I remember iPads coming out. I remember all of that stuff, but we were slightly, I feel like, I don't know if I'd say our brains are evolved, because our brains are evolving all the time and obviously don't stop until you're like 30 odd. But we were one step ahead of it for that really interesting period of time, whereas you compare it to younger family now, and they've had iPhones, they've had iPads, they've grown up, Alexa. I think that's always the funniest one when I hear kids, Alexa, talk to Alexa and all that, because it wasn't a thing, it wasn't as normal for us in our age. And I think that's really interesting. As for why it's becoming more common, spoiler alert, unfortunately, a lot of people are blaming the internet, which I am 50-50 on. But I think the counter movement to it, that where people are taking the internet away from young children. Look, if we look at Australia and the smartphone ban, I think that's really, really interesting. Considering the but people of my generation, we had almost unlimited access to it, because although we didn't understand the positives of it and how fast it was growing, we also didn't understand the negatives, and the safeguarding wasn't in place in the same way that it is now, I feel, for younger children. But so if we actually look at the causes and why more Gen Z are having it, because that seems to be the popular conversation that's going on online, why are more Gen Z people having internal identity crises than ever before? Are we just anxious? Are we just, as that phone ruined our brain, as Mother said? And unfortunately, yes. If we look at the internal factors, while I was doing my research, I stumbled upon, and I thought this was really interesting. And I'm going to say now that I reserve the right to make any judgment on any of this. I am doing the research and I'm trying to present it to you in a way that looks at all sides. Hold that thought, because this is a little bit controversial, but the internal factors, they say, the internet, the academics say that the reason they think that we are having more identity crisis is because we're growing up with more fluid identities. It says here, the abundance of self-chosen labels and online communities creates ever-changing identities, which can make it harder to find a stable sense of self. Which I think is really interesting, because there's obviously a load of pros and cons to that. The pros being that, yeah, you can be anything you want to be, you can be anyone you want to be, and that is absolutely fascinating. That's incredibly freeing when we look at our parents and our parents' parents, who were forced into such small type boxes. They did exactly what they were supposed to do, had the careers they were supposed to have. They stayed in their lane, basically, and we don't have to do that. We are much more fluid in our sense of self, in our expression of ourselves. And I think that, again, that has only been around recently in terms of history. There has been a shift towards more fluid identities, which I think our parents do struggle with. They do struggle to understand, because it's not something that they grew up with. And then we come to the external factors. Obviously, the digital influence, that you can see and access anything online 24/7 in real time. And whilst that is fabulous, And it's incredible that we have access to such a wealth of knowledge and community, because I really do believe that when used for good, it can be incredible. It's tough and it's strange. And in conversation, obviously, with my parents, trying to get them to understand just how overwhelming that can be is mad. I remember vividly during COVID, we were bombarded. Well, I was bombarded again because I was looking for it with statistics and what was going on. And I remember it being so overwhelming. And again, when Putin invaded Ukraine, I remember I couldn't pull myself away from my phone. I was absolutely obsessed with going through what was happening. And my dad sat there and he was like, well, you need to put it down. And I was like, but I can't put it down because I need to know what's going on. And he was like, why on earth do you need to know what's going on? He's like, not that it won't affect you, because obviously it does affect us and we should know what's going on. He's like, but we didn't, like, I was so, and I cannot stress this enough, I was so anxious about it. And he said, back in our day, we wouldn't have known. We'd have watched the news at 6:00, it would have ended and it was gone, and that was your little, oh, here's what's going on. And then it left. But the fact that we are so exposed to it all the time, I think, is just doing everyone's heads in, to be completely honest with you. It's definitely one of the things that I pinpoint whenever I'm overwhelmed. I mean, even, when I love TikTok, I will preface that. I love TikTok, but I really struggle with it because, sometimes I open it and within the first 5 minutes, not even 5 minutes, but the first 5 videos, you've got someone having a massive high, you've got someone having a massive low. We're just so exposed to information all the time. And I think that is another reason. There's more options now than there's ever been because we can see it. So when you couple that with the fluid identities, the fact you don't have to be anything you don't want to be, or you can be whatever you want, vice versa, it creates a very bubbly, I think that's the right word, but it creates a very fizzy environment in your soul, maybe. And then another one, again, slightly controversially, but probably something that you guys are again aware of, that our generation seemed to be rebelling more against the boxes, like the fluid identities were rebelling more against the boxes, but less in terms of internal boxes and also more external boxes, sorry. So religion, I think, is absolutely fascinating, and we'll cover that more because I'm absolutely fascinated by religion. But organised religion, that's changed and changing, I would argue. Stable career paths are changing, nuclear family structures are changing, and geographic rootedness, 4 things that our parents and our parents' parents specifically will have experienced massively. Not that their lives were ruled by it, but that there was, you went to church on Sunday, you did a profession probably, or you joined the family business. I mean, and this might be completely naive for me to say, but from the experience that I have and the way I've seen my extended family certainly follow those paths, I can completely understand. I mean, I was a freelance wedding photographer for 3 years, and I remember explaining it to my nan when I quit my job. And she was absolutely terrified for me. She was like, but so I don't understand, like you don't have a job. I was like, no, Nanny, of course I have a job. I take photos at people's weddings. That's not a job. I was like, well, it pays the bills and I really enjoy doing it. So I think it's a job. How do they find you? Where's your, like, she couldn't understand A, the concept of being freelance, and B, the concept of not having a boss. It was a really entertaining conversation, and one that certainly opened my eyes. And we'll cover more about this soon because, again, I think this is so interesting. But we are internally and externally, environmentally, community-wise, everything I feel has become a lot more fluid. And I think COVID is to blame for a lot of that. And that's a very interesting conversation that we will be looking into, about how COVID changed so much more than I think we realise. And COVID, again, for me, came at a really pivotal point. I was 2021 when COVID hit. My university experience was cut short. I had to move home. I wrote my dissertation in my bedroom, all of that. It was really, really interesting. But I think COVID gave us the opportunity to rebel against a lot of these things. And I think now the world, I'd argue, is coming back to normal. We've had sort of 5 years of bubbliness, and it's finally starting to settle again. And there's a really interesting dialogue about that going on at the minute. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an insight into the quarter life crisis, as it were. I say, and we are going to be unpacking loads and loads of things. I want to look at the Great Scattering. I want to look at communities and villages. I want to look at protecting peace and setting boundaries. I want to look at attention and social media. I want to look at religion. I want to look at work. I want to look at friendships. I want to look at money and the financial pressures that we're facing and the loneliness epidemic. I really want to dig into why we're feeling this way and if there's a solution or if it's something that we need to ride out but not ride out alone. What is going on? I really have no idea, but I'm hoping that this is going to shape itself as we get going. But this is the gist of it. I'm going to do research because if there's one thing your girl can do, it is research. And then I'm going to chat to you guys and hopefully explain things in a way that makes shit easier to understand, I think is the gist of it. I want to start building this community because the conversations I've had with my friends around this have been so reassuring. They really have. And I'd hate to think that anyone is having these. I'd hate to think that anyone's sat by themselves wondering all these things because it's totally normal. I think that's the main takeaway of this is, yes, we're having identity crisis, and that's so normal because your brain is developing and solidifying, frontal lobe development and all that stuff. It's starting to happen. Realistically, everyone has had these, our grandparents, our great grandparents, our great grandparents. I'm sure they sat around it. I mean, they were probably, I won't say that because that's probably not appropriate, but they were probably having these conversations as well, just in a different context. And we're having them out loud. I think that's the thing. Again, with the advent of the internet, everything is hyper scrutinized, isn't it? It's hyper looked over. Everyone's been having these crises, if you like, and we don't have to do it alone. I think that's the main takeaway. So the aim of this is for me to do some research to make myself feel better and then share it with you guys so that hopefully you feel better and create a community where we're all crashing out together. Because what could be more fun than us chatting, shooting the shit together, really? So do stick around if you can bear to listen to me waffle on, or if you're interested in any of these. I will again say that I am in no way, shape or form a professional, just someone that is really, really interested. So this is your official welcome to join the Quarter Life Crisis Club, and I will see you guys very soon.